And we are live, ladies and gentlemen. We are live. Welcome to the Reasonably Fine Art Talk. This is your friend Charlie Hunter, and a happy, happy day it is in Bellows Falls, Vermont for two reasons. One, the great Betty Sue is upstairs. She's monitoring this conversation. She will be throwing up, she will not be throwing up, but she will be putting comments and questions that you might have during this Reasonably Fine Art Talk. She'll be putting those up on the screen that you can ask Dave all kinds of questions. The second reason it's a happy, happy day is that cat Miles, my neighbor's cat Miles, who looks a lot like my cat Charbonneau and has been missing since the 22nd of January, was found today. He was found across the river in an adjoining town by the police, and he's been returned to his home. He's going to have a felony cuff on from now on. But anyway, it's a happy, happy day here in Bellows Falls, Vermont, and we are particularly thrilled to have with us one of my favorite painters, one of my favorite human beings, the great Dave Santillanes from somewhere in Colorado. Where are you, Dave?
I'm in Wellington, Colorado, so just north of Fort Collins, about an hour north of Denver.
Okay. So, and are you native to there, or did you drift
I am
there?
Born and raised in the area, lived in a few parts of Colorado, but you know, it's home. It's hard to leave this place.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm sure. So, and for people who are unfamiliar with the legend that is Dave Santillanes, how did you come in to do what you do? We were talking a little bit about that before we just.
Yeah, and I always wanted to be an artist. I drew with a pencil all through my formative years. Never picked up a brush until probably about the year 2000. But I went to college for, for fine art, and just didn't like the curriculum. So I switched to history, of all things. You know, has nothing to do. Well, as I was telling you, Charlie, I was no more marketable as a historian than an artist. But I decided, this is what I love. So I studied history for a couple years. And then I realized I was never going to get out of college. So I switched back to art, got a graphic design degree. And then I ended up working, odd jobs for a while. I was a ski bum for a little bit. I did wildland firefighting for a little bit.
Wow.
And then started working in the graphic design field, and I worked at a photo lab in Fort Collins. And we used to, it was a real fine art photo lab, and I did the digital work. And I got to meet artists like Richard Schmid and Skip Whitcomb, and all of these art heroes of mine would walk in with their paintings for us to photograph. So, and it was it was about that time that I had just started painting, picked up a brush, started going outside painting, which that's where I really started learning how to paint. But it was a great job. You know, if you have to have a day job as an artist, this was a great one to have, because I was able to meet all of these art heroes of mine at the time.
Right. So were you aware of people like Richard before they came in, or is that how you became aware of them?
I was, and I can't remember. So I can't remember if one of his books had already been out at that time, but I knew of Richard. He was already one of the guys I was following at that time, and I think I first became aware of his work from the Arts for the Parks competition, the very first one, which as soon as I started painting, I was entering that show and trying to, get in that show. But I was aware of his work from that. And I think at that time it was a huge award.
Right. It was an enormous award. I remember him talking about that, but it was like $60,000 or something, right?
Yeah, and I bet it took them literally 30 seconds to figure out Richard's was the best painting, because it was unbelievable. But yeah, I think it was something like that. But yeah, and then after that, I started painting, and all at that time, all my art heroes were painting outdoors. So I thought I got to paint outdoors, which was normal anyway. I was backpacking
Right.
and always in the backcountry anyway, so it wasn't a huge leap to throw my paints on my back. And so I would hike in and paint and hike out with a terrible painting,
Hmm.
um, but a good experience. And slowly over the years, started getting some traction. And then by 2012, I had enough of a reputation to go full time as an artist.
Right.
And I
And
haven't had to have a day job since. So,
and I think it's interesting. I mean, the we were talking about this also before, that there are a bunch of us who sort of 2012 was about when we kind of entered the world of being self-employed representational artists. Um, did you were you terrified of like, am I going to actually be able to make a living, or was it just sort of mundane of like, well, I can do this and this sold and I've got enough to pay the rent this month, and so it's one step after another, or was it a
well,
great faith?
it was a little bit of it was I was kind of pushed that way because at the time in 2012 wasn't a great economic year, and the company I was working for, the photo lab, was finally starting to feel the real shock of the digital revolution at that time. So a lot of their big traditional film accounts were no longer. So the company was struggling, and the owner was struggling with health. He had stage 4 lung cancer, and so it got down to there were 4 total people at the shop. It was me, I was the only employee, and then the owners. And so if I left, they would be in a real lurch. So I stuck around. They couldn't pay me, and then this was about a year of where they really couldn't pay me consistently, so I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
making money. I kind of joked with my friends that it was my volunteer job, but I didn't want to leave them high and dry like that. So I stayed and worked for about a year, and not getting paid by them, I was making a living as an artist. So I started thinking, this is working. I'm figuring out a way to do it. And it was just me at the time. I didn't have a family.
Right.
But it told me that I could do it. And then, when there was a good time for me to part ways with them, I did, and that's when I
Right.
ultimately made the leap to full-time artist.
Well,
So,
getting to know you over the last 10 years or so, I mean, I think your work is just extraordinary, and your control of atmosphere and relative color temperature
yeah.
is just magnificent. And so let's take a look at some of your stuff, and let's do the do. So first off, I don't think people are unaware of the scale that you normally work at. I mean, this
Huge.
is look at Dave at work on his giant easel. This is in upstate New York, and unfortunately, it's taken seconds before the breeze came up, and the painting was last seen over Port Dover, Ontario. Uh, and yeah, you notice he had to have his own Farmall tractor to torque the adjustment handle.
Those giant knobs.
Uh, to
Yeah.
tell a story about this picture, Dave.
Well, so y- obviously it's been terribly photoshopped together by myself. Um, but at the time I actually posted this on Instagram as kind of a funny counter. My buddies at the time were always giving me grief for painting small outdoors, small being 9 by 12, 12 by 16, which I didn't think was
That's
small, but they were painting 30 by 40 outdoors. So I posted this as kind of a ribbing them back a little bit. But and what was amazing is how many people didn't think twice. They just thought I was actually painting that big outdoors.
You said a bunch of galleries were like,
I
Dave.
I got contacted by galleries and people wanting to commission giant paintings, and now I do paint, maybe not quite that big, but I am painting a lot bigger in the studio. Maybe the biggest one to date is about 50 by 88 inches. So, but
When you did you find it hard to transition into working larger scale? Do you work with larger brushes when you're working larger scale? What's the
yeah, it's hugely different. I mean, there's not a lot of comparison, but I used to think, okay, back before I was painting large, I was painting 9 by 12, and I would use a fairly big brush on a 9 by 12. I use a number 16, which is about a 2.5 inch brush
right?
on a 9 by 12, just to get those big shadow shapes blocked in. And I kept thinking in my head, well, to transfer this up, my brush has to be probably about this big, and I would be wielding it, like a sword. So I couldn't conceptualize how I was going to paint big. And then I just started breaking it down a little bit. So I do use bigger brushes, but not 1 foot,
Not proportionately bigger
not
brush.
proportionately bigger. But someday if Rosemary ever puts out a brush this big, I might have to buy it.
Well, she sent me a couple of. I've got one that's about I think it's 9 inches, which I love. I use it for skies all the time.
Oh yeah,
now on the
that's great. So it's 9 inches wide. That's great.
9 inches wide, yeah, but they're not in the catalog anymore. She's going to be a guest. I'm gonna bug her about making those again, because I think that is so easy for us to get into, of getting smaller and smaller and tighter and tighter and tighter until you're completely frozen. So
well, and that's the problem with painting large, is it's hard to avoid the painting looking tight. You may paint it with the same brushwork, but magnified on a larger scale, it becomes tight. So to get out of that, you really have to paint free on those big panels.
But that's really interesting, because I mean, you do have a fluid atmospheric. Keep going back to atmospheric as the adjective for you, but you do have really fluid brushwork. The brushwork itself is really beautiful, and the fact that you manage to convey that as you are working larger is really something. Betty Sue, could we have the next slide, please? Let's see if Betty Sue is. Yes, there we are. So talk to us a little about this one.
Well, this is a fairly, it's probably about 6 years old, but it was one of those kind of breakthrough pieces. I think we have those as artists occasionally, just paintings we go back to and say, I did something there. I did something there that was different than I was doing before, and it worked. So this is where I was really starting to develop a sense for how to construct atmosphere, how to construct it before I paint it. And so this one really came, and I was changing a lot of things too. I wasn't married to the view that I saw within a little viewfinder. I was making a painting, and I think that was huge, to divorce myself from the scene a bit and actually make a painting. And so this is one of those.
Rather than literally being a journalistic reporter of a scene, you're creating a painting. Now, online, out there in the internets, there is a 1 hour plus lesson with you. I've only watched part of it, but I would urge everybody who's watching today to seek that out, because it's really interesting to me that you started, and it looks like this painting kind of follows the same pattern. You had kind of big warm brushwork in the foreground, and then you started building those atmospheric grays at the horizon line, and then you constructed out of that. How did that method of painting come about for you?
I think it really came just through analysis over time, analyzing my failed paintings. And I think failed paintings are a great learning tool, and analyzing them and trying to figure out, well, why is this one working and this one isn't? And it kept coming down to shadows. And shadows, in this painting's case, being the darkest darks on each plane.
Right.
In the paintings that failed, I always seemed to start those distant shadow shapes in the wrong value or the wrong temperature or the wrong chroma, and that would kill the feeling of atmosphere. And, this painting in particular, I thought I was pushing atmosphere, but in the end, it felt more like the scene than when I didn't push atmosphere. So those distant trees in the background, they're slightly lighter in value. They're cooler, slightly cooler, and less saturated. So a little more gray, a little more blue, and a little lighter, and it just pushes those trees back, but they still feel like dark shapes. And I
Right.
think that's the idea that we were talking about earlier about relativity, is those shapes will feel dark back there because of what they're surrounded by, not because of the value of it.
Mm-hmm.
So in all of that, really, I mean, one thought leads to another thought, and eventually we're, eventually you don't have to think about it, you just do it. But
Right.
early on, analyzing that's really how it developed. I needed some way to get more consistent.
Right. Well, I noticed on that paint tube video online, you the source photo that you're working from in that image, you actually go in there and do a color swatch in Photoshop to say this is the
Yeah,
color.
that's the color.
Then you modify it
Yep.
once you're applying the pigment to the surface. But I think the thing I really admired about that is that you're not being hidebound by, oh, well, Winslow Homer wouldn't have had the ability to do that, so I'm not going to do that. Those guys totally would have. If they had Photoshop, they'd be using Photoshop. Hey, Betty Sue, can you switch our heads so that my head gets blocked by the comments rather than Dave's? Thank you. I don't know how to do that. So Streamline Video is the best on how to build the layers of atmospheric perspective through proactive management of palette. It's well
Thanks.
worth the investment to understand how to build the scene.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and what's funny, the swatches, I really just, because obviously you can't do that out in the field, and I don't do it in the studio anymore because it's not necessary, but it was a way to analyze other artists' work and say, or photos, photos are not representative of real plein air color. But when I was struggling to try and figure out how to paint, I would pull up a photo and mix the color, and it would invariably look wrong, even though it's the color that I'm seeing. And then I realized I'm not seeing color correctly. And then I'd eyedrop that color in Photoshop just to help. I mean, I had a lot of downtime at work, so what else am I going to do? So I'm eyedropping a Richard Schmid painting, and I'm eyedropping, these colors. And I realized that my perception of color didn't take into account where that color was in the landscape. And that's huge because, and I always use this example, if you think you see a yellow building on a distant mountain, check that color, because it's probably maybe a warm green or a gray yellow, but it can't be cad yellow because that same building in the foreground would be cad yellow. The building on that distant mountain would be some blued out version of yellow. So
right.
it taught me a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I like that you're talking about is kind of using all the tools that are available to us to figure out the questions that we have to solve for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you can't just be told it and understand it. You have to figure it out. I mean, and talk a little about. We should go on to the next slide, because otherwise, I could talk to Dave, ladies and gentlemen, for hours and hours and hours, because everything about Dave is interesting. His painting is interesting. His family is interesting. The way he attracts bears when he's painting outdoors is interesting. Um, but talk to us. This also has an example of your darkest dark in the foreground.
Yeah.
And one thing that Michelle Dunaway said to me once is that darkest darks in the foreground are almost invariably warm. And that sort of was an eye opener for that's in like 2015. She said that to me, and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. And I've always said the darkest dark in the entire painting is always in the foreground. Now we can say, well, that middle tree, the base of that middle tree feels really dark. Well, having painted it, I know I've made it a lot lighter than that foreground dark, but perceptually, they're the same dark. And I think that's something that I used to get wrong all the time. I would look in the distance and see what I would think is, oh, that's pretty close to black. And in the foreground, oh, that's pretty close to black too. Well, two blacks can't interact that closely and still create atmosphere. So on purpose, I'm forcing myself to see those middle darks as a middle gray instead. And then they're going to feel just as dark, but now you've got atmosphere and now you can step into a painting. So that's the big difference. And so anytime you think you see something black in the background, force yourself to paint it maybe in the middle gray and see if it doesn't feel right even later.
So dark darks in background are going to be cooler than dark darks in the foreground as well.
Cooler and less less saturated too. So if you get those distant darks, this pure cerulean blue, they're going to jump forward just as much as they would if you hadn't painted them cooler.
But that's something where it's helpful that titanium white is actually a cool color.
Absolutely, it works for atmosphere.
Right.
It's okay to get chalky in the background. You just don't want that chalkiness to come to the foreground. And that's a huge reminder that you want to get more saturated in the foreground.
Right. Right. Now, another thing that you're a master of are edges. Did that come naturally, or did you sit down and spend a lot of time thinking about edges?
I spent a lot of time studying Richard Schmid's edges. I think he's the ultimate master of edges, and using it in landscape, really, edges are the holy grail because it's so hard to put a finger on what makes it work and doesn't. But I think, it might have been Richard that said this, but if you squint down and see an edge, you should probably paint it fairly hard. Right. But if you squint down and don't see it, you've got some flexibility there to really, fuzz those edges out. So it just a lot of my earlier work is all edges everywhere.
Right. Yeah. It really is. That's part of why I paint monochromatically or close to monochromatically in plein air, is it forces me to pay attention to value and edge, which is easy, which we so often don't when we have the crutch of chroma,
Yeah.
Now, Betty Sue, can you throw Nikki's comment back up about the problem with photography? That was an interesting point. I just wanted to read that again. The problem with photography is that it heightens and distorts the middle ground by shrinking it and therefore making it look darker. I think foreground darks seem transparent.
Yeah.
So, photography is highly suspect. It's an unreliable narrator.
So. It is. And I think going outdoors and observing and painting has taught me everything about using photos, because I was using photos early on before painting outdoors, and my paintings were really not good because I didn't know how to translate a photo into paint. So I think that's been huge.
It's very interesting when one goes out and paints with people who are primarily studio painters as opposed to really don't have experience as plein air painters. They can be very accomplished studio painters, and they find plein air painting just overwhelming, the amount of information being given.
Yeah.
Whereas those of us who were fortunate enough to get used to it early on, when I was busy
Yeah.
trying to find my voice, I was going out there and doing horrible acrylic plein air. I didn't know they were called plein air paintings then, but they were
Yeah.
plein air paintings, learning how to paint. But
And I think, plein air painting also gets you out of some bad habit. I had some bad habits from painting from photos, especially design. I was composing as if I had a camera window and I had to fit everything I wanted in a square. So if it didn't fit in this little square, I'm not painting it. So I've got to find that perfect location where everything is absolutely perfect inside that square. And that's how a camera composes. But as an artist, we have so many other tools. I mean, we've got a 360-degree view. Usually you want to constrict it to at least 180 so the light is consistent. But you have this whole view, and why not use it? And whenever I design something and I change things a lot, I'm thinking, no way does anybody know where this was? And invariably, I'll get someone who says, I know right where you were when you painted that. And I think that's gratifying.
well, it's story truth as opposed to literal truth.
Absolutely. Yep.
So.
Yep. Absolutely.
Next slide, please, Betty Sue. Grand Canyon. I assume this is the Grand Canyon. It might be your driveway. I don't know.
Oh, that's my backyard. No, I wish. This is Grand Canyon. And this one is a 40 by 88 painting. So this is a very large piece developed from small studies. I always start and work things out, work color out, work design out on a small scale. You can imagine if I tried to work design out on this scale, how many years it would take to paint this painting.
Right.
But working the design out small is really helpful. It's fluid. It's instant. I mean, you can move things around really quickly with oil paint. But to me, the Grand Canyon just demands a large canvas. I wanted to go 1-to-1, but that's a little too much. But 40 by 88 gave a lot of size and dimensionality to that.
How did you decide on 88 as opposed to 40 by 80? I mean, rather than 1x2.
It is strange. I get connected to that study, and once I get that study working right, I don't want to change the ratio too much. Occasionally I'll change it, but it happened to go nicely at 40 by 88. So
you stayed with it. Yeah, I mean, because if you change that even little crops on that, the flare of the light in the lower left would be altered if that was a little less. Certainly the upper right quadrant would be radically changed if you crop that in more. Yeah, everything you do is really considered, which I think is.
I try to, and I'm considering where primary focal points and secondary focal points are landing on the surface, and how to lead the eye through the canvas. All of those things are considered, and sometimes I may have a plan, but it's a bad plan. But I always say at least I had a plan.
Right. Well, and on something like this, I mean, this one is fairly easy to see where you're directing the eye. I mean, you've got that bright.
Absolutely, and it's at a 1/3 kind of a powerful focal point position.
Right. Oh yeah, it is. It's near. It's a little. But you can always. One of the things I love to do is just draw a grid to fit a painting that I've already done. So
put it right on top. You'll save the historians some problems later.
Exactly. Now Helen had asked earlier how you maintain the energy from the field and carry it into your studio paintings. To her, the field is intuitive. The studio is kind of more technical.
I think she's right on with that, because and that is the hardest thing, and we were just talking about it, is how do you create because in the study, I don't even think about brushwork. I just let my hand do what it needs to do to get the color right.
Right.
Um, in the studio, I find myself thinking a little bit more about brushwork because I don't want it to get static. The one thing that I do is because I like wet into wet. In a study, that's easy, that's no problem. In these bigger paintings, it's really difficult. So I'll paint it in sections, mostly, I mean, not small sections, but like the top. I'll do all of those background cools and get those in. And then I'll get the midground. So same basic approach of hitting those dark darks throughout the atmosphere and getting that atmosphere down. But that allows me, if I'm painting in sections, let's say maybe I'm just doing the right third and doing the cooler darks, the mid darks, and the foreground darks, I've got that representation, and then I can paint wet into wet for that section. And so that works. And then I'll do another section and paint wet into wet. But what affords me doing that is having that study. Without the study, I'd be lost in that endeavor.
Right. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. Well, and I think that's true. One of the things that I think a lot of aspiring painters hobble themselves with is the need, because they've got a limited time to paint. They feel the need to be getting on base, hitting a home run, at least getting a double, every time they're up to bat. And that's not what the game is. The game is a lot of watching called strikes and balls and broken bat bloopers and
Well, and I had a lot of broken bat bloopers in plein air painting, and I think those are valuable too, because you learn something from them. But I think part of that concept comes from, for me, came from plein air events where you had to hit it out of the park because it was going to go in a frame. Instead of stopping where I may have stopped if I wasn't in an event, maybe I would stop with just a few color notes and call it a beautiful study. No one would maybe understand those notes except me, but I think that's the beauty of the study is they're very brief notes that mean a lot. So,
right.
But yeah, I agree with you that there should be some allowance to for the base hits. Those are good too.
The base hits have, I mean, if right here you've got, this is Telluride with the classic buildings and the horses, this is a saleable object because there are a lot of recognizable representational. It's a story.
Yeah.
But I bet in your study, in your color notes, it's almost abstract. I mean, it's basically, we do abstract paintings, and then because we are not museum track artists, we need to create something that someone's going to want to buy.
Yeah.
So we make it, oh, that's a horse, as opposed to that is a warm golden rectangle.
Well, and what's funny about that too is when I block in the atmosphere, it is just abstract shapes. Those horses are just blobs. They're not even formed because they don't need to be at that point. Early on, I'm just looking for atmospheric precision. I don't care what it looks like. It's just, this is the foreground object. It's the shadow is warmer and darker, and the midtones and the mountain is cooler and, less saturated. I get those big shapes working together atmospherically, and then I can envision that, okay, now this is where the horse is, and so on. So it's a fun place to be. And, when I was painting plein air and people were watching me paint early and I was doing this approach, it was always a little bit unnerving, thinking, okay, they think I don't know what I'm doing because I've got these big blobby, Rorschach test shapes in this painting. It doesn't look anything like that. But for me, I was building atmosphere, and then it was fun to see him come back through and say, oh, okay. Now
Yeah, I find that deeply unnerving when I've got something, and one wants to be respected by total strangers, and you
Yeah.
can feel the people standing behind you thinking. You can almost see the thought
Oh, yeah.
balloons of what is that guy doing? You know,
Yeah.
it's gonna be something. I promise. I
Yep.
promise.
Yeah, I promise, just come back. Or maybe this guy snuck in with his painting gear and shouldn't even be here, but yeah.
Has no idea what he's doing. So James asked us what size brushes that you use on the larger paintings.
So I've got one that's a 3-inch is the biggest. Let me see. It's a rosemary, like 3-inch brush, which is not big enough to be honest, but it just makes you work a little bit faster. But it's the biggest. I've tried house brushes and they're just too flimsy. They
Uh-huh.
just don't move paint at all. So this one's a really good one. It's Eclipse, but
Haven't tried the eclipses yet. Now, Derek asks, being a master of oils, have you tried acrylic, gouache, etc.?
I've tried acrylics early, but actually before I was painting in oils, I tried acrylics first. And then again, the paintings that I loved in museums were all oil paints. So I thought I'm just going to give them a shot. And I never went back. So short answer is no, I really don't paint in any other medium. I always joke, once I figure out how to use oils, I might go back and try to dabble in other mediums. But I
Yeah,
always
no,
enjoy though.
well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I always enjoy seeing these artists who are masters of all these different mediums. It's fun to see just how their style translates into the various mediums.
Right, right. Well, oil has a luminosity that at least I can't get out of acrylic. To me, acrylic is always, uh, it's always going to just look kind of more opaque. And
Yeah.
but now that woman was asking the job where you had the time to practice the colors in Schmidt's paintings. That was when you were working
Oh,
at the photo
yeah.
lab.
I was kind of joking. I was working at the photo lab, and I would take some time every time we'd scan a Richard Schmid slide or whatever. I ended up doing a lot of the scanning for his landscape book and his Alla Prima book. But having that archive of Richard's paintings on the computer, um, I made time to look at his work, and you could zoom in with the zoom tool and get your face right up to his paintings. So it was a lot of fun. But that's where I really studied his color and mostly his edges.
Right. Well, that's yeah. I mean, and when you have that job of doing the scanning and stuff, you're really giving those paintings a close study. So
Yeah, and I'm doing the color correction
right,
in Photoshop, and that's huge too. Really studying color.
right.
So
I bet.
yeah.
Do you use flake white or titanium white, or when Grant? Can you put that back up? When Grant Redden was instructing workshop here at our place, the artists had quite a discussion about that topic. What are
Oh
your
gosh. I I hate to sound not very educated, but I don't pay my I use titanium white, and why I use it and why I don't use other whites, I don't have an educated answer on that. I just like titanium white. It works great, does what I need to do.
Well, I mean, I think once one has a palette that one understands and can trust, that's the key thing to find. It's not that there's going to be one color that is a magic per se, going to be a magic color.
And sometimes it drives my wife crazy because she'll like try this, and I'll be like, no, I like what I like, and I don't want to spend time figuring out something else. So I
Right.
just stick with what I like. And most of my colors are Rembrandt for no other reason than I started using it. I started using Rembrandt, liked it, and never really experimented a lot. So my
Well,
wife always says, "Well, how would you know if you don't like something if you don't experiment?" And I guess I'm okay. I'm okay with not knowing, but
very good. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. Another atmospheric beauty there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I've started kind of coming full circle. When I first started painting, when I didn't know how to paint landscapes, I was painting a lot of figurative stuff, and um, always wanted to paint them in landscapes, but didn't know how to paint landscapes. And that put me on a journey of figuring out how to paint landscapes. And now I'm coming kind of full circle and putting figures in landscapes and, objects in landscapes. But it really still comes down to the landscape. I
Mhm,
like to think of my work as landscapes first and everything else, right after that.
mhm. Do you find, I mean, do you do, Don Demers one time, I saw him talk and he joked that he'll do a seascape, and if it doesn't sell, he takes it back from the gallery and he puts the sailboat in. And
Oh,
then
that's great.
if it doesn't sell, he'll, he'll take it back from the gallery and put the seagull in.
Oh,
And then
that's
and then if it doesn't sell, finally at the end, he'll put in the red buoy. And then it'll
well, if this one doesn't sell, I'm gonna put an alien monster coming around that.
Now, one thing before we move on to the next slide, the thing that strikes me about this is the really limited color range. I mean, you're mostly talking about grays here,
Yeah,
and it's one gray next to another imbues the one becomes a greenish gray
yep.
as opposed to a purplish bluish gray. I mean,
Yeah, and someone who looked at this painting would say, "Oh, look at those yellow trees." Well, they are yellow perceptually, but in reality, it's a gray. It's a very warm gray, maybe with a little bit of yellow ochre in it. And
right,
that's all the yellow it is. It's not to the cad yellow would explode on this scene.
right.
Just subtle use, and those subtleties go a long way. Another thing that a lot of things that I do drive my wife crazy, but she'll say in a landscape, "Look at that beautiful blue barn." I'll get, it's really just gray, just slightly cooler gray, and then she'll slug me in the stomach. But that's really what color is. It's all grays to a certain extent. The real saturated color is going to be in the foreground,
Right.
where you may have those pure cadmium yellows, oranges, pure cerulean blues in the foreground.
Right. Well, it was funny. I went out to Montana in the end of October, beginning of November, and I was wanting atmosphere and roiling clouds. I had utterly blue skies, not a cloud in the sky for like 4 days, and I'm here back in the studio trying to okay, how is this going elevator going to look reflecting light from a roiling sky as opposed to this total cerulean blue world that I'm looking at. So,
Yeah, and I've even had to start muting skies a little bit because I used to always see them as this pure cerulean, and when I would get that color on, it would just scream
right,
and demand attention. And I thought, even if it is that blue, I can't paint it that blue in my painting because it's not the focal point.
right,
And to have this brilliant blue sky, just you forget about the rest of the painting.
right.
So
Well, someone asked, Derek asked if you like the tonalists such as Ennis, and because I mean they were masters of atmosphere.
oh, I love it, and I love, I love them for more than just atmospherics, but their designs were amazing. And I think those real quiet, peaceful paintings resonate with me more than anything.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I think if you love atmosphere, that is that does have a certain contemplative aspect to it, that you're
Yeah.
noticing atmosphere as opposed to noticing the things.
Yeah. Yep.
So, next slide, please, Betty Sue. Now, this was the study for a much larger one. Didn't you just do a big version of this?
I haven't done a big one yet. This is going to be for a larger painting. It was a quick, and my quick studies are starting to take me longer and longer now, but this was done in a day. These studies used to take a couple hours. Now they're taking several hours. And I think that's a good thing because I have more time and I can, really explore some things a little bit more in depth. But this is right in my, backyard, not right in my backyard, but in the area. So
That's that's it. Why do you think it's taking longer now?
I think it's because my sensibilities for what works and doesn't has evolved. I think I would just stop short of some things and say, I know what I mean, but you know,
Mhm.
is uh, it complete enough? And it doesn't mean getting tighter. It just means getting the colors more accurate. So I think that's what's leading to it. I haven't really put my finger on it, but I'm not questioning it. If it takes longer and I end up with a nice painting, I'm okay with it. If it takes longer and the painting was great 3 hours ago and now it's bad, then it's a problem. But as long as it keeps getting better when you're working on it, I think you're okay.
Next slide, please, Betty Sue.
Yep, another study. And I mentioned we were talking about I'm doing these smaller studies in anticipation of doing them. This one I think is going to be a 40 by 70. So right around in that, where I can really get it. The thing, someone once asked, when you do the study with working out everything, and then you go large, how do doesn't it get boring? And for me, there's so many changes that happen subtly on the big ones. Overall, it's probably going to look a lot like this piece, but there's a lot of subtleties that change. Um, there's and sometimes there's major things that change on the big one, but for the most part, it's just you have to take a different approach to every section that you're painting, and to me, that's exciting. So it might bore the pants off someone else, but I love painting scenes more than once.
Right. Yeah. I think it worked. It worked for Monet with cathedrals and hay bales. So I think it works for us okay too. Question: when you're working in the huge scale, is that on stretched canvas?
No,
Or
I started using, I fell out of love with canvas and started painting on panels outdoors. And then when I first started painting big, I had to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? Because these panels get so heavy
right,
at 40 by 70. So, and I was using 1/4 inch MDF panels outdoors.
right, with BIN primer as
Yes.
your.
One primer. I slap a coat of line coat glue on it and then put primer on that, and I just love that surface. I've been painting on it since, well, about 2005, I would say, and just love the feel of it. It mimics a really fine linen. um
Right.
you've
It does have a certain drag. There is a drag on the
there is
brush. Yeah.
there's a nice drag on the brush, but it allows the paint to glide, which I love. um and on the big ones now, I'm building my own supports, but I'll build a frame
Mhm.
and put 1/8 inch MDF across it and glue that down to this frame, and that's been great. It's exact same surface, so I don't have to change things when I go big.
Right. We'll address Nikki's question in just a second, but the thing, the problem I have when I work on stretched canvas that size is boinga boinga boinga.
Yep.
It's really.
Yes.
And Doug Pryor suggested I use a hollow core door. So I ordered a hollow core door from the lumber yard, and the guy,
That's
when
great.
they delivered it, they were like, "Charlie, we know you like good quality things, so we got you the heaviest one we could." It's like, well, actually, That,
Yeah, yeah, that was
yeah,
I have one. I thought about painting on one of those because I have one, and I thought this would save me a solid day of craftsmanship.
right.
But it's still a little heavy, so I thought I might not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a good impulse there, Dave. So throw Nikki's statement up there again. Interesting about sky. Your concept of making a painting overlays the need for hue accuracy. Your concept of making a painting overlays the need for hue accuracy. Do you
Yeah.
feel tonal shifts are more important, Rick?
Yeah, I think so, and I think what she's getting at is why I mute the sky a little bit. And I think, um, part of it might be because sometimes when I mute the sky, it feels more accurate than when I paint the sky like I see it. And part of that might be I'm seeing it wrong. But when I mute the sky, there is this thought of intention that I don't want the sky being overwhelming the rest of the painting because no one will look at my beautiful horse and rider because they're looking at the sky. So there is a little bit of it, but that's a good point.
But
Almost everything is um, secondary to the painting, you know.
well, it's arranging. It's like short story writing, that what the author chooses to put the focus on in a story isn't necessarily. I mean, there's a highway behind the protagonist that the cars are whooshing by, but that may have nothing to do with the
Yeah,
story being told. So
yeah.
you mute the sky. So next slide, please, Betty Sue. Speaking of muted, what's your darkest dark in this one, Dave?
Oh, it's probably, and I forget which way the scale goes, but if ones are darkest, it's maybe a 4.
The horse's mane, right? That's the
Yeah, that'd be the darkest dark, and it's not pure black. It's definitely, it might even be a 5 as the darkest
now
dark.
something like this. No photograph is going to come anywhere near getting the actual tonalities that you're trying to explore. So,
No.
so what are you working from?
So I have, the horse and rider is almost full value. So I had to compensate within this painting. It, and that's one thing that I've been doing once I started to figure out how to paint landscapes. Every object fits within that landscape atmospherically. So you figure out where you are in the atmosphere, and if in that point in the atmosphere your darkest dark is a 5, nothing gets darker than that at that particular spot in the atmosphere. And that's how you can that's how I feel confident to put any object in any landscape because I already have the color palette. So it's very liberating. It sounds like it's very analytical construction, but that structure helps free you up to really do whatever you want to the foreground. You can move a tree from the left side, from the distance to the foreground, just by using the colors that you have in place for that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But you've done a really deep dive so that you're able to take
Yeah.
source material of any value and translate it into the language that you use in your image making.
Yep. And this piece probably has 4 or 5 reference photos. It's got a plein air study of snow. There's a lot of different references coming into one to create a painting like this. And then the stream is just completely made up.
Right, as they so often are.
Yeah.
Michael asks, do you use glazes to achieve soft transition or brushwork for soft edge control and surface luminosity?
Just brushwork because most of my paintings are wet into wet, so I'm not glazing. Once it's dry, once it starts to tack up, hopefully I'm done at that point. There's very rare occasions where I'll work back into a painting and use glazes, but for the most part, I'm too impatient for that. I love working wet into wet, and so I try to achieve what I need to with that.
Right, and that's also part of why you work in sections in the really big
Yeah.
paintings.
the
So
big
there's a lot
paintings.
of people who do that.
Yep.
Next slide, please, Betty Sue.
Yep. This is another one inspired. I packed my paints into the Ruby Range, which is near Crested Butte, and did some plein air studies, and then of course added the writer later. But and to me, sometimes the elements are really a foil for atmosphere as much as intrigue for the viewer. It's also for me a foil for atmosphere because it allows me to create these darker objects and
Mhm.
really push those distant layers. But this was fun. The most fun part for me with this are those mountains and just those subtle shifts between one mountain and another, which are uh, maybe just a slight shift of value and temperature is all it takes to pull one mountain forward. There's probably 5 layers of atmosphere in just the mountains, and it's
Right. Oh, and you get that sense of clouds moving across the mountains and changing the patterns on the mountains so fantastically on this. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
Ne-
Yep. This was fun. I actually had to where the view was that I wanted was, and they're always like this. They're always on the opposite side of the stream, so I had to throw my boots around my neck and throw all my gear on my back and wade across this stream. And I painted it a little bit bigger or a little smaller than it is, but those are the fun parts about plein air painting. Is I remember everything about that day.
That's
It's like that.
that is one of the great joys is that life is so fleeting, but yeah, I can look at virtually any of my plein air pieces and oh yeah, and I bought an apple at that
Yeah.
store and that
Yeah.
crazy person came up and talked to me for a while,
Oh
etc.
yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It's a very in-depth diary
yeah,
insert.
exactly. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. Now, this is a bit different for you. It's an
Yeah.
interior and it's primarily of a figure. So,
Yeah. Yeah. This and I always felt, even because I grew up drawing a lot and I always felt like I could draw. And then when I started painting, I thought, I have no concept of how to translate this tool into these tools. And that was always a struggle for me. And, part of the problem was I was looking for a direct translation. Like, this is how I use the pencil. I draw a line, and there's a line there. So I need a tiny brush so I can get that line perfectly. And it was the wrong concept because, and I tell students in my workshop, when you paint, you create line very differently. You create line using shapes. Throw 2 shapes together, and you've created a perfect line. With pencil, you just draw that line. And coming to terms with the difference, that key difference really opened up drawing with a brush for me. And so this is, it's not a case where I draw the figure and fill it in with paint. The whole thing is just drawn with the brush. And, it still amazes me that with this big fat tool, I can get detail.
mhm,
And, but changing my concept of approach really was the key to that. And so this is one of those where you know, it's complete drawn with the brush, but I had a study that I did smaller, so I was able to translate that
right.
into, into
That's
big.
that's a great point you make, though. That you with paint you define things with the way shapes meet up with one another, and that is what gives you the line. Yeah.
It changed my approach. It really changed because when I first started painting, I would draw on the canvas and fill it in with paint, and that was my concept. Is okay, it's just adding color to my drawing, and it was 100% the wrong approach. So, you know,
Right.
it's fun to be able to sit down, you know, with no drawing tools and just draw. You know, it's a fun exercise, and it's a challenge. It still is.
Right. Well, as soon as it stops being a challenge is when it really stops being fun. I think then it
Yeah.
becomes work or drudgery. I mean, so Jeff says, couldn't agree with you gentlemen more. Correct thing to say, Jeff, about the documentary power of plein air study. So one of the best ways to be fully present and truly experience a place. Yep.
Yo, absolutely. Yep. Yep. And sometimes it, um, you know, it gives you the title of the painting, so to speak. It gives you the story. Um, you know, the first image you showed in the slideshow was titled "The Coming Rain," and it was really about the coming rain because I was sitting there watching these storms come in, and I knew I was going to get wet, and that became the title of the painting because I was
Right.
just waiting for that rain to come.
Right. Right. Exactly. Well, that's the journalistic aspect of
Yep.
the plein air thing. Next slide, please, Betty Sue.
Yep. And then this is a 12 by 16. So this is the normal size that I paint outdoors, but 12 by 16, 9 by 12. And this was up in the Northeast. I can't remember this Stage Harbor. But just fun to, you know, paint atmosphere where you're not seeing miles of it. You know, this isn't miles and miles of atmosphere. This is really 2 layers of atmosphere, that background and the boat.
Right.
And to push it for that really helps, I think, get the concept of even in a still life or even in a waterfall that is right in front of you, the back part of that waterfall is different than the front, which is different than the ground right in front of you. So you can push atmosphere really applies to anything we paint. Even a still life has atmosphere.
That's atmosphere in the distance between the furthest object and the nearest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. The world in a drop of water.
Yep.
Quote.
Yeah.
Yeah. And final slide, please, Miss Betty Sue. This is so damn cold looking.
That is, this takes me back to, we used to get a bunch of artists, you know, from our area, and we would commandeer, it's the 10th Mountain Division hut system in the backcountry. And we would all get a hut. And the huts are cabins. Hut is kind of a misnomer. They're actually really nice cabins in the backcountry. And so in this photo, the cabin is right behind me, and we're at about 12,000 feet, about 11,000 feet.
Leadville doesn't have any oxygen, if I recollect.
Yeah. No, and it affects your paintings. It's either the cold or the lack of oxygen, but it's hard to paint up there. But it was just a fun time. It would serve as a base camp to really explore that high country in the winter. And so it was a lot of fun.
Oh, cool. Well, Dave, this has just been up. Sandra wants to know what colors of blue do you use for the snow?
Oh gosh. Well, in the foreground, they're going to be more those shadows will be more saturated. But so the blues I usually use in the foreground probably, and this is very general, but ultramarine and cerulean in some combination.
Right.
In the background, there's a touch of gray in some of those shadows.
Yeah, I would urge folks to look at you can look at the free video that's online. I'm not trying to sell it. It's really informative. And you really describe your palette, and you've got that puddle of kind of a neutral gray that you're using that you go back to constantly.
Yep, cold gray, and I use it as a mute saturation, and also you can think about it like this: in the background, that gray is quite warm. In the foreground, it's quite cool, which you know I always think it's funny that it's called cold gray because it's not always cold. It depends on what you surround it with. But
exactly.
But it's a very useful color.
Right, Betty Sue, can you make our heads large again for a moment? Oh, yeah, he gets pixelated. Maybe he's not pixelated on anybody's screen but mine. But now he looks normal again. Dave, this has just been so much fun.
Oh, I appreciate it, Charlie. It's fun catching up with you.
You're so good at talking about this stuff. Do you do any online workshops or just in-person workshops, or what do you do?
I do. I'm doing a 2-day online workshop with Mastrius, and that's coming up March 2nd. And with those, I'll go through. I've got a slideshow I go through, which talks about a lot of the stuff we talked about, and then I'm going to do a demo, and just try to make it as close to a live workshop as possible.
Right.
And then I do some online stuff through my website as well, like a mentoring program through that.
Oh, cool. Okay. And so this is discover more at daysanti.com.
Yep.
All right.
Dave Santillanes is too long to type, so I shortened it.
I agree. But I may sign up for that online thing. I think your approach is so interesting.
Well, anyways, I'm honored to hear that from you.
I haven't signed up yet, but I may. So Nikki, so cool, wicked, brilliant discussion. Thank you so much. So fun, both of you. That's how we feel about it as well. So, all right. Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And we'll see you next week, I believe, for another reasonably fine art talk. Bye-bye.